Listeners, beware. This podcast contains themes of the macabre and does not shy away from the details. Our content is graphic and our language is colorful. We might not be your cup of tea, so listener discretion is strongly advised. You have tuned in to The Killer Tea, a podcast hosted by two best friends with a proclivity to decipher the deeply demented minds of murderers.
Welcome to Season 2, Episode 11 of The Killer Tea. Today we'll be discussing Samuel Little,
The stroke and killer.
We are your hosts, Christina.
and Chelsea.
And today, we are in our motherfucking feelings.
Hardcore, deep in our feelings, lots of rage and feminist energy coming your way.
I know we have said this a number of times at this point. I feel like we inadvertently picked serial killers one right after the other that were really the extremes of all the other episodes.
Yeah, I feel like the whole of Season 1, while we had serial killers who were really rough to talk about, I feel like they were split up with Black Widows, and it made it more palatable.
For those of you who have not heard who Sam Little is, this is going to be your trigger warning. There are going to be lots of mention of sexual assault, rape, and horrible, brutal murder. All right, y'all, strap in. This is actually our hometown killer. Even though he was not born in Ohio, he was raised in Ohio, so unfortunately we are claiming him. Samuel Little was born on June 7th, 1940 in Reynolds, Georgia, to a troubled 16-year-old teenage mother who was thought to be a prostitute named Bessie Mae Little. His father was the 19-year-old Paul McDowell, but not much is really known about him either. Police and other authorities believe that Bessie may have given birth to Sam while she was in jail, but there isn't exactly any confirmation for it. However, shortly after his birth, his mother abandoned him as a baby on the side of a gravel road. It was then that Sam's paternal grandmother would step in to raise the boy, moving him and their family to Lorain, Ohio.
There's not a whole lot that is known about his relationship with his mother or his grandmother or what the rest of his childhood really looked like. There isn't a lot of information out there, but what we do know is that he was a really troubled child who struggled a lot with authority, discipline, schooling, and basically just following the law in general.
Here's the first really unusual thing about Sam. He realized at a very, very young age that he had not just a reaction, but a sexual reaction to the female neck. So when he started school around the age of 5, he had this teacher. And one day, the teacher was just rubbing her neck, and he describes having a physical erection at the age of 5 to this.
It's not unusual for men to be attracted to the necks of women. Every man has their different attraction points with women, but this attraction, he doesn't go about this in a healthy way later in life.
Later, a couple years later, when he's in the 3rd grade, he also describes seeing a classmate, a little girl with red curly hair, who had these big green eyes and looked at him. And when she did that, she touched her neck. And this moment imprinted again on his brain as yet another time that he had a strong physical reaction to women's throats and their necks. And he started to fantasize. It doesn't describe if this is him fantasizing about wanting to hurt them by like strangling them at a young age.
Or just finding their necks very attractive.
Yes. Just like how we mentioned there isn't a lot about his childhood, bear in mind that, again, these are statements coming directly from him as well.
Right. And so, you can take or leave as much of what he says as you want. I mean, these are his memories. But again, we know serial killers tend to over-exaggerate maybe a little bit. But hey, who knows? Around the age of 13, Sam committed what we know to be his first crime, and he stole a bicycle in 1954. He was charged and sent to the Juvenile Detention Center, the Boys Industrial School in Lancaster, Ohio. And his intake papers listed him under the name of his grandparents, McDowell, and said he was there for stealing. His IQ was listed as 96, and his mother's whereabouts were unknown.
96 is on the lower intelligence scale, right?
Average is 90 to 110.
Okay.
So he's about average.
But he did not do well in school, ever. So this industrial school, which is what they started calling them instead of reform schools, basically saw the children, the boys, living in racially segregated cottages. So white boys went to the white ones, black boys went to the black ones, Hispanic ones went to the Hispanic ones.
Well, I mean, this is the early 1950s, so it being segregated in the United States is not all that surprising.
Sam was assigned to farm duty, which is where they typically send the more problematic children, which is definitely a way to describe Sam. But we don't really know what his treatment was like there. I know, Chelsea, that you had done some research on children being in the system around this time period. Do you have anything to add?
There was a study done in 2015 by the Annie E. Casey organization that found that there was systemic maltreatment of children in juvenile systems throughout 29 states, and that 10% of the children had reported being victimized sexually while in state institutions. This is in 2015. So my assumption would be that in the 1950s, maltreatment was probably more prevalent. We know we see that in Catholic orphanages.
Yeah, we talked about that in a few episodes ago.
We have. We've
in
talked
the
about
same
that.
area as well.
Being mistreated would not
unsurprising.
Yeah, it would not be unsurprising at all.
Now, the boys were put on some sort of behavioral scoring system, and the path to early release from the reformatory was to earn as few points as possible. Well, by the time Sam was released in September of 1955, he had racked up to 47. Most others had literally 1 or 2. So again, he has problems with authority.
Definitely. And his time there was not enough to discourage his quote-unquote problematic behavior. Other petty crimes would also soon follow, including shoplifting, fraud, theft. He just was a very troubled youngster. And after being convicted of breaking and entering into a property in Omaha, Nebraska, Sam was sent to an institution for juvenile offenders. Now, Omaha, Nebraska is a long way from Lorain, Ohio. That's like probably an 11 to 13 hour drive. How did he get to Omaha, Nebraska?
I'm curious if this first trek across the United States introduced him to being somewhat nomadic.
It may have.
Because the other transition that he made was when he was an infant, so he wouldn't remember anything about it.
Definitely.
But Sam would never complete his formal education, and he dropped out of school once he was in high school.
And again, 1950s.
Perfectly average.
Pretty normal.
By the 1950s, Sam had begun this crazy nomadic lifestyle of moving state to state, like we mentioned. He would be arrested countless more times in his youth and into his early 20s. Sometimes it was for fraud, drinking and driving, armed robbery, and the occasional assault. And yes, even rape.
It's fascinating to me that he was able to escape any real prison time.
It was almost as if because he was so much of a vagabond that the police just wanted him out of their area, like go back to where you're from, get out of here, rather than actually deal with it. And yeah, there's going to be a long thing about this, guys. Just strap in.
You know, yeah, we can assume that him being a nomad is probably what kept him out of doing any real prison time. And it wasn't uncommon for him to just drive hundreds of miles in the matter of days to escape suspicion. And he once even told investigators that he would drive from New Jersey to California in just a few days. I don't know if you've ever driven across the state. I've done it several times. That is not a fun drive to do.
It's grueling.
It's
grueling.
Rough.
Regardless, his life of crime continued to escalate as he matured throughout his life. According to Sam, most of these crimes were done to survive and get money that he needed to buy booze or drugs. In 1961, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison for breaking into a furniture store in Lorain, Ohio. And then he would spend time in Ohio's most infamous prison, the Mansfield Reformatory.
The Mansfield Reformatory
It's a big deal in Ohio.
It is a huge deal in Ohio. I've been there a couple times. I think you've been there a time
Chelsea
or two.
and I went there to go get the shit scared out of us at Halloween.
Yeah, at Halloween, they have a massive haunted house in the old prison, not the new modern one, but the old reformatory. And yes, it's a haunted house and there are people jumping out at you and scaring you, but I really think it's the eeriness of the reformatory that really amps up the creepy factor.
And in present day, that reformatory is decommissioned, but if you're curious, you can actually book walking tours and overnight tours.
It's supposed to be one of the most haunted prisons in the United States. Whether you believe in that or not is up to you, but they do have overnight camping trips, if you will, in the prison.
Just a few fast facts for you guys.
Don't mind us geeking out over our Ohio haunted locations.
Reformatories. In his late 20s, Sam Little actually moved to Florida to live with his mother. Now, when I read this, it was a huge surprise to me because, for the third time, not a whole lot is known about his mother or their relationship, but I was just shocked because he describes his mother being a prostitute and abandoning him. I was just fully stunned that they had any sort of relationship where he could move in with her. I don't know if she was trying to help him get back on his...
Who knows? Maybe she reached out to him during his childhood. Maybe they had some sort of long distance relationship, and as he got older, that kind of became his home base. Well, we know it did become his home base ultimately.
All we can do is really speculate. I just found that little tidbit to be fascinating. It's here in Miami, Florida, that he spent some time with honest work, surprisingly.
As a cemetery worker, no less.
Yeah, and an ambulance attendant. Okay.
Very interesting career choices.
Again, this is all according to Sam.
Yes.
At one point, Little told investigators he had earned somewhat of a living as a local boxer, and he even touted that he learned this skill while in prison, and he was a local prize fighter. And while investigators who were trying to form bonds with him in order to get a confession much later on in life used this as a tool to a bond with him, there was some indication that he was into boxing, had some skill, but nothing that said that he was a prize fighter earning money from it.
What's interesting is that Little could never form any meaningful, strong bonds with people or even places. He never was and never would be a family man, though he does claim to at one point have been married. They were married in Lorain in 1965, but then separated shortly after. And he did have 2 long-term girlfriends, but only one would seem to be of importance, who was Jean, but we'll talk about her more later on.
Yes, we will.
But I'm sorry, you can't say that you were married if you got separated very shortly after.
What is that?
Doesn't
Disillusionment?
count.
Is that what they call it? In 1966, he's arrested for beating a woman. Shocker. And by 30, Little had begun to kill. And his first kill would be triggered by a woman who was touching her neck. On New Year's Eve in Miami in 1970, Mary Brosley was sitting at the bar where he claimed to recognize that she was a sex worker. And he introduced himself and they hit it off. And later he was able to get her into his car, strangle her, drive her into a wooded area, and dump her body in the Everglades. And I have a direct quote from him. It's disgusting. It puts you in his mindset. So I'm going to share that with you now. She was a big old blonde Roundabout turn of the new year, 1969 to 1970, Miami, Coconut Grove. She was a hoe, a prostitute. She was sitting at a restaurant booth, red leather, real nice. She crossed them big legs in her fishnet stockings and touched her neck. It was my sign from God.
Well, a few months later, he ended up moving from Miami back to Cleveland. And in May of 1970, he was arrested for robbing a gas station in Westlake. While serving time for the robbery, he was charged with sodomy and aggravated assault.
Pause right here. Do they mean sodomy while he was in prison? I couldn't figure that part out.
I can't either.
Is sodomy a charge that is only done to men at this point in time?
Probably.
Interesting.
But this is where things get really bizarre. The robbery case made plain dealer headlines because the police forgot all about Lucy Madero, Sam's girlfriend, their literal star witness who was going to testify against him and get him put away for years. And they left her in the county's derelict 1930s jail for almost 6 months.
That is, the prosecutors, everyone forgot that they had her in that jail. That's fucking insane to me.
Do you forget?
She's their star witness.
How do you fuck that up?
She's literally going to testify against him, and they need her in order to win this case, and they forgot about her.
And then left her in there for 6 months. This jail was so badly maintained and falling apart, inmates could talk through holes in the walls and ceilings.
So while being held for no good reason, Lucy would meet Aurelia Jean Dorsey, the would-be next girlfriend of Sam. She was a cellmate that struck up a friendship with Lucy. Now, she was in there for shoplifting, and she's significantly older than Lucy. She's like 30 years her senior. Jean would be released from jail and then meet up with Sam before their trial to warn him about Lucy's plan to testify against him in court. What the actual fuck?
This leaves Sam and Jean conspiring together when it came time for the trial. Jean would even testify on Sam's behalf, and the jury found him not guilty in March of 1972, and he was never tried for the charge of sodomy. This is some of the worst police work we've ever talked. I mean, not even police work, but like judge, jury, like just overall justice system fucking failure.
I don't understand how Jean befriends this girl, then meets the girl's boyfriend out in the real world, and knowing that he actually committed this crime, which I believe was the robbery, warns him about, like, when did she become infected? I don't know. Oh my God. That just makes my brain explode. So anyways, Aurelia Jean Dorsey was described by Sam as being no beauty and 30 years older than him.
What a romantic man he is.
But because of her loyalty, he decided that he was going to go ahead and shack up with her. In my personal opinion, I think that he identified a woman that he could take full advantage of. And because both his mother and his grandmother had died that same year, leaving him virtually homeless, and Jean was obviously very smitten with him, he just saw an opportunity and he snatched it up. The other thing is Jean is an expert shoplifter. I mean, she can't be that good. She was caught, but still. Jean essentially just shows Sam how to do better at shoplifting, and this is how they fund their nomadic vagabond lifestyle. And as they crossed over from state to state, Little and Dorsey kind of got this schedule and routine together where night after night they would somehow find a shitty roach motel or a cheap apartment somewhere, and then Sam would put Jean to bed and then go out into the world.
It sounds like he's treating her like a small child. Like, I'm going to tuck you into bed, and then I'm going to go out and do my horrible shit that I'm doing.
It's not really described if this was ever like a sexual relationship, but he describes her as his old lady, and she's old enough to be his mother. I don't know. He's just taking full advantage of her and her loyalty and maybe her naivety. I don't know.
For sure. This is amazing to me. Like, this is fucking unbelievable. In the years between 1957 and 1975, Sam Little was arrested 26 times in 11 states, a number which only climbed over time. He dodged charges both petty and felonious in his travels, including shoplifting, rape, assault, kidnapping, and murder. How the fuck was this man not in jail? I mean, by 1975, the states had to have been talking to each other at least a little bit.
A real tragedy that happens here because of Jean's meddling. So many more women are going to die. I mean, she doesn't know. I'm assuming she doesn't know.
I would hope she doesn't know.
But had she just left that alone, he would have been put to jail for robbery and could have been in there for 5, 10, who knows, with all his other prior convictions. So many women died because of this woman being nosy. In September of 1976, Sam is arrested for the intent to do the most despicable rape outside of St. Louis, Missouri. The victim tells police Sam choked her from behind with an electrical cord, then shoved her into his car and beat her unconscious. He drove them to a remote location, violated her, and I think he believed that she was dead and dumped her out of the car. Obviously, she survived, thank God, and he was actually sentenced to 3 months in the county jail.
Okay, can we just talk about this 3 months?
I know.
Can we talk about this fucking 3 months for rape? Who else only got 3 months for rape?
It's disgusting. I don't know. I have no... They knew that he kidnapped her. They knew that he beat her. They knew that he raped her, and that he got 3 months.
This also is kind of a reflection on our justice system, because often the women that Sam targeted were sex workers. And let's be honest, we know that especially during the 1950s to 1970s, even today, sex workers are not taken seriously when they go to the police, if they even go to the police.
Part of the reason why they don't go to the police is they don't get taken seriously.
Nothing is done. I mean, and cops will straight up admit that nothing is done for sex workers.
In November of 1982, Little is once again arrested for shoplifting in Mississippi. Police believed that he matched the description of the suspect in the death of Melinda Rose LaPree, and they actually charged him with her murder. A grand jury, however, declined to indict him. However, he is extradited to face charges for the rape and murder of yet another suspected victim, Patricia Ann Mount, in Gainesville, Florida.
In January of 1984, Little is tried for the murder of Patricia Ann Mount, with whom he was seen leaving a bar in 1982. Her bruised and naked body was found in a field sometime later. After deliberating for less than 30 minutes, jurors acquitted him on all charges due to the mistrust of witness testimonies.
This was a timeline that Oxygen released on their website, and it's a really fucking polite way of saying they didn't want to listen to the witnesses because they were fucking prostitutes.
It's exactly what it is. Prostitutes were witnesses. No one wanted to believe the prostitutes.
Juries typically treat prostitutes as if they have no credibility. It's infuriating. They're still human beings. And credibility as a witness is a really important thing. Prosecutors and defendants care very, very much about that sort of thing. But oftentimes, more often than not, when you have a serial killer, they are choosing people on the fringes of society. They are choosing women who are displaced from their homes and earning money through sex work.
Sam Little himself admitted that he chose prostitutes because he knew the police would do nothing about it.
Little would tell investigators that he killed at least 10 women in the Midwest and the South during the 1980s before he eventually ended up in California. And some of those murders have been linked to existing Jane Doe and missing person cases, and then others, nothing. There's nothing. The authorities do tend to believe him because so far,
everything he says has added up perfectly well.
In October of 1984, Little moved to California. He was then arrested for kidnapping, beating, and strangling 22-year-old Lori Barros, who ultimately did survive. 1 month later, he was found by police in the backseat of a car with an unconscious woman who was also beaten and strangled in the same location as the attempted murder of Barros. But ultimately, the jury deadlocks and he has to plead guilty to assault and false imprisonment and only serves 2.5 years in prison for both of those crimes. So you're telling me he was caught in the act and he got 2 years?
He was beating and assaulting someone, trying to kill her, and he gets 2.5 years. Upon his release in February of 1987, he immediately moves to Los Angeles because let's flee to the other side of California. Why not? And he commits more than 10 additional murders. He murders Carol Alford, afterwards dumping her body in a south central alleyway. Alford was one of 7 women Little claims he murdered in the city that year, though their identities remain unknown. So the question is, how is he getting away with this?
As we mentioned before, he would purposely target marginalized women of color, sex workers, drug addicts, because he knew that nobody cared about those women. He knew that they were the least likely to be investigated, let alone reported, or even make the news. He lured them with drugs and promises of money. This whole time, he never carried a gun or even a kill kit. He killed with just his bare hands.
He would call his victims my girls. He jokingly described them as grapes hanging from the vines, ready for plucking.
Even the FBI has openly admitted that most of the murder cases they were able to eventually link to Sam were not just unsolved, but they had gone cold if they were even barely investigated. A little less than half of his victims haven't even been identified to this day. And the FBI kind of explained this as many of these deaths were not classified as homicides, but attributed to drug overdoses, accidents, or natural causes. That was his MO. That's what he was hoping for. That was his strategy.
Basically, the police did exactly what he wanted them to do, which was nothing.
I mean, what about forensics? We know some forensics exist in this time. This is Robert Ressler's.
This is the prime time.
It was very unsubstantial. However, in these circumstances, it wasn't even done. There was almost none or next to none because these deaths weren't properly investigated. DNA wasn't even collected. And then very few of them had even been entered into the VICAP database. I guess it's worth mentioning that testing wasn't a huge thing, but it was still somewhat of a standard practice to collect some DNA for future generations to be able to test it.
Yes, because they knew that DNA testing would soon become a thing. Hair testing had just broken into the forensic scene. There were steps being made. So why they wouldn't just collect some of the DNA evidence that was there for later is fucking beyond me.
I mean, bringing up the hair is a great point. While they're not able to test the DNA on the hair at this time, what they're doing is they're analyzing what the hair looks like and comparing it to samples. I mean, the whole process throughout this entire thing is just very frustrating. Sam's method of killing also didn't always leave a lot of obvious signs that the death was a homicide. Like I mentioned before, he wasn't bringing a kill kit, he wasn't using a gun or even rope or anything. He was literally using his hands. This one-time competitive boxer, I'm doing air quotations, will usually just shock the shit out of women by beating them. I mean, once you get hit in the face, you're stunned.
Yeah, he would cold clock them. Just they'd get in the car and he would land a punch straight into their face and oftentimes knock them out almost immediately.
And at the very least, he's disorienting them so they can't react.
You know, the cops, as far as they know, these women are leading high-risk lifestyles, and so there's no point in
They're
them
not a priority.
investigating this.
They're not a priority.
They would consider this wasted effort.
Prostitutes are a thing for him. I don't know if there's any correlation with the fact that his mom was a prostitute.
There could be. I mean, psychologically speaking, it would make sense for there to be a correlation there. And, well, I mean, just talking about serial killers overall, being abandoned by your mother is psychologically damaging. And he was, in an essence, abandoned by his mother. Even though he was still raised by his family, his mother was not a big part of his life as a child. And oftentimes, in the serial killers that we see, and we see this especially in killers like Kemper or Gacy, mothers that aren't super loving and wholesome and warm and nurturing often cause damage to their children, and it seems especially their sons. And they have this fixation and what I would call quote unquote mommy issues.
The next thing that I have is a quote from a journalist, and I have heard actual other psychologists who've spoken about his sexual desires and fantasies kind of relay this same thing. But here's what it says. Because killing was synonymous with sex for him, Little said he made encounters as long and as slow as possible, often letting his victims repeatedly regain consciousness. And that's a quote by journalist Jillian Lauren, who wrote the profile of Little for the New York Magazine. This is very reminiscent of Keith Hunter Jesperson, and actually, in some ways, they do remind me a lot of each other. However, I almost feel as if Keith was more emotionally present or capable even than what he is.
And I agree with you 100%. If you did not listen to our 4-part mini little series on Keith Hunter Jesperson, I highly suggest you go back and listen to it. It's very interesting and in-depth. But Keith would often feel remorse or feel like he was being haunted by those who he had killed. And later on in years, even admitted to feeling guilt and feeling, sorry and trying to figure out why he had done what he had done. And often put a lot of blame on his family.
But Little never does this.
No, he has no remorse. This is just what he wants to do, and he does it.
In 1988, his girlfriend Jean died tragically of a blood aneurysm. She was never considered an accomplice in his crimes, though I'm a little sketchy on this detail because I'm not 100% convinced that she ultimately didn't know what he was doing. And I say this because Jean was seen and know to actually detail and clean his car frequently. As we know, his vehicle was where many of the actual crimes took place.
Maybe she was just turning a blind eye to it and didn't want to acknowledge what was going on. I mean, either way, it's inexcusable. In 1989, Little murders Audrey Nelson in August, Guadalupe Apodaca a month after.
We're just going to keep going through them now at this point. I want to make a note here. Unfortunately, we don't even have enough time to list all of his victims.
So extensive.
In 1991, Little steals a carton of cigarettes back home in Ohio, and then he hits someone with his vehicle as he's trying to flee the scene of the crime.
Over a carton of cigarettes.
Once again, he's arrested and charged with aggravated robbery. And the cycle repeats itself until 1998, where he pleads guilty to the attempted robbery for his arrest in 1991, and then he's sentenced for 2 years in prison, and it's the same shit, different day.
We're going to skip all the way ahead to 2005. So we're skipping 6 years now. Little claims his final victim was a woman named Nancy, whom he strangled in Tupelo, Mississippi. Investigators believe her identity could be Nancy Carol Stevens, whose body was found off of a road that August.
In 2007, Sam is arrested in this guy gets fucking around. In Los Angeles for possession of cocaine. He pleads guilty. After failing to attend a court-ordered drug rehabilitation program, a bench warrant is issued for his arrest. Now, things are finally getting momentum and getting interesting.
But not until September 5th, 2012 is Sam arrested. He is found at a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky, and is extradited to California to face a narcotics charge, after which authorities used DNA testing to establish that he was involved in the murder of Carol Elford, killed on July 13th, 1987, and Guadalupe Duarte Apodaca, killed on September 3rd, 1987, and Audrey Nelson Everett, killed on August 14th, 1989. I have to say, there was one detective who was a woman, Misty Robertson, and she was like a dog with a bone. She had been looking at cold case files, and as a woman in a predominantly male field, she was less inclined to dismiss the word of prostitutes.
Thank fucking God.
Thank fucking God for Misty. So she had a very big hunch that Sam was the one behind these murders, but he couldn't be found. I mean, he's a nomad. So her best bet was this bench warrant. And she finally was able to track him down in Louisville, Kentucky at a fucking homeless shelter and is able to bring him back. And he's charged on January 7th, 2013. A few months later, the police said that Little was being investigated for the involvement in dozens of murders committed in the 1980s, which up until then hadn't been disclosed. In connection with the new circumstances in Mississippi, the LaPree murder case was reopened. In total, Little was tested for involvement in 93 murders of women committed in the U.S.
Little was tried for the murders of Alfred, Nelson, and Apodaca in September of 2014. The prosecution was actually able to bring the DNA evidence to the table, as well as several testimonies from witnesses who were actually attacked by Little at different times throughout his criminal career. Because remember, some women did actually survive. Some he presumed were dead, and others they managed to get away. September 25th in 2014, Little was found guilty and he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. On the day of the verdict, Little continued to insist that he was innocent. As of 2016, Little was serving a sentence at the California State Prison in Los Angeles County. However, he does not like the California State Prison, and he wants out of there.
Yes, he does.
He gets working with this Texas Ranger who decides on a hunch that he's going to interview him for a few other crimes. And he's the best scenario is he's hoping to get a few more of
The Jane Does. Figure out who they are. He's getting a lot more than he asked for.
Little would then go on in those meetings that they have together to confess to around 100 crimes.
Not 100 crimes. 100 murders.
When this ranger and these detectives are doing their investigation and interrogation of him, they have to form bonds with him and build rapport in order to get the confessions that they need to get convictions. And they, even though he's got life sentences, they want convictions because they want to bring justice to these women. And I applaud them for that and for their families. As we have talked about before on this podcast, there are recordings of the interrogations that if you are not informed on police tactics, it might disturb you. They're very casual with him. They're almost buddy-buddy. They call him Sammy. They, get him essentially whatever he wants. They joke about things. They talk about boxing. And it's all very, very casual. But it's essential because this technique is what's believed made him feel comfortable enough just spewing out all of these
heinous, horrible things that he's done to over 100 women, most likely.
They even allowed him to draw pictures of the Jane Does. This is crucial to the investigation. And I've heard some other podcasters downplay that, and I guess they don't want to give Little credit for it, but I'm not going to downplay it. I looked at the pictures. The pictures were, I'd say it looked like a somewhat talented 14-year-old teenager did them.
We're not talking like great works of art here, but enough.
Better than what I could do.
Yeah. And it was enough that they were able to use these pictures to help identify other victims. And these portraits had actually been released to the FBI, and one portrait solved a cold case in Akron, Ohio.
Families actually looked at these pictures and were able to identify Jane Doe's. They're family members. And sometimes he would draw depictions of jewelry that were identifiers, and other times just the artwork was good enough. The thing about him doing all this was, oh my God. The reason why Sam can recount things in such great detail, which he doesn't always remember the dates correctly and he doesn't always remember the names correctly.
Not to forget, he's 72 years old when he's finally arrested.
And the amount of information he's able to relay is admittedly kind of impressive. But he's able to do this because he's a very visual person and he relives these murders routinely. And the drawing, the artwork, that even enriches that experience for him even more. And while it's appalling and disgusting, the reason why they called him the stroke and choke killer is because as he was strangling women to death, he would oftentimes masturbate. And when he was giving his confession, the detectives had to sit on the opposite side of the table because that's exactly what he was doing as well.
Sam is actually quoted as saying, "I never killed no senators or governors or fancy New York journalists. Nothing like that. I stayed in the ghettos."
There are some miscellaneous quotes that I have here from him. They're crude and just bullshit explanations, but one of them is he believed he was commissioned by God to kill his victims to alleviate their misery, and at other times he felt like he was possessed from the devil. We do have several unmatched confessions that he has made that go into great detail.
If this is something you're interested in seeing, these unmatched confessions, I am happy to add them to our website. And if you want to go and have a look at them there, you are absolutely welcome to.
To this day, the majority of his victims remain unidentified. Don't let that make you believe that they didn't happen. The police have little to no doubt that he is being emphatically truthful about the number of people that he has killed. I think there's at least 50 confirmed. He has already surpassed the Green River Killer.
Which, up until Little was arrested, held the record for most kills in the United States.
Little is still alive to this day. He uses a wheelchair. He has diabetes and a heart condition. And that's why we believe, because of his failing health, he continues to work with Texas Ranger James Holland to help identify the victims and the details of his crime. I also think there's many selfish parts of that where,
I think he's getting off on being the most prolific serial killer.
I think being able to relive his crimes in graphic detail and share that, I believe he's an old, bored man. And furthermore, he was homeless whenever he was picked up. So he was able to use his confessions as a way to get out of that Los Angeles prison and be moved. It's not as if he had some great awakening of guilt.
No. This man has no remorse for the things that he has done.
So do you have anything to add about his psychology?
Because we don't know a whole lot about his childhood, a lot of it is speculation. The fact that he was never able to form any meaningful bonds with any one person leads me to believe we may be looking at a case of antisocial personality disorder.
I believe that 100%.
Which makes complete and total sense in this. And if you haven't listened to previous episodes, APD is now the more commonly accepted form of psychopathy, and what traditionally people think of psychopaths as would actually be APD. That is where I am leaning towards. A little bit of facts on children who have been abandoned by their mothers and just kind of our foster system overall, which no, he wasn't technically in foster care, but he did spend a lot of time in juvenile detention centers.
Years.
In the last day of 2016, there were approximately 437,000 children in the foster system across our nation.
That's fucking nuts.
19.5% of children under the age of 18 were estimated to live in poverty in 2016. That's a lot of fucking kids. And one study showed that more than 90% of youth in foster care with 5 or more moves become involved in the juvenile justice system. And then another study found that by the age of 17, over half of youth in foster care experienced an arrest, conviction, or overnight stay in a correctional facility.
Those numbers are just astounding. It's just staggering to me.
It is. And since 2016, the amount of children in foster care has dipped slightly, but not enough to make that big of a difference. There's also statistics supporting that children who are exposed to violence are more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol, suffer from depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic disorders, fail or have difficulty in school, and become delinquent or engage in criminal behavior. We have discussed this before.
Many times.
Many times. And 60% of American children who are exposed to violence, crime, or abuse in their homes, schools, and communities.
While we're here, while we have a platform, and while the state of the world is what it is, we continually get back on this topic of marginalized women and children. Unless you've been sleeping under a rock lately, sex trafficking has been on the top of everybody's news feed. And my fucking problem with it is most of the information out there is wrong. I cannot be a true crime podcaster who continually talks about murdered and abandoned women and not say something about this.
And I feel like at some point we're going to need to do a bonus episode on this topic
seriously.
alone, because we don't have enough time to really get into it in one episode talking about a serial killer as well. So I think we really are going to do a deep dive on this probably sometime very soon.
What do you think, guys? Would you like to hear a mini-sode about sex trafficking
And sex work?
But I'm going to leave you with this. The most at-risk people for sex trafficking and labor trafficking are women. The most at-risk women are Black, Indigenous people of color. The most at-risk children are Black, Indigenous people of color. Prostitutes, LGBTQIA children that are displaced from their homes, those are the most at risk. And we see it over and over and over again. And if it hasn't changed from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and now, then we have to do something about it. So that's all I'm going to say. I'm stepping off of my pedestal.
I think even if y'all don't want it, we're going to do the episode anyway. And if you don't want to listen to it,
we're grown-ass women.
That's fine. Don't listen to it. It just won't be your episode for you.
Okay. Dahmer scale.
Hear me out.
Oh, God.
While he is the most prolific, and he did kill a fuck ton of people, the last two guys we covered were worse.
I disagree. They were more gory, yes, but he brutally beat these women.
I know.
And then he raped them.
Maybe it's because the others were kids. And to me, I'm just like, what?
He's still he's a 10 out of 10 for me.
He's like a 9.5 for me. He's like a smidge less worse. Like a smidge, like a smidgen, like a little boop. And that's it.
Oh my God. All right. We definitely need a palate cleanser. Palate cleanser.
This is your palate cleanser.
This one has a picture, so it's harder to do, but it's funny because I think every single woman who watches true crime does this exact same face. When you're watching a true crime doc and the suspicious husband says, "I love my wife and I would never do anything to hurt her."
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Me, 4 hours after I should have gone to sleep trying to solve Jill and Benet Ramsey's case.
Me after finishing You and the Ted Bundy tapes in less than 2 weeks. Male energy in my healing space just isn't optimal.
It's a sign that says introverted but willing to discuss true crime.
When you meet someone who's into true crime mysteries, did we just become best friends? When you want to bring up true crime during the conversation, but then you remember they're normal and extremely sensitive people.
It's a picture of Scooby-Doo and the Mystery Machine team. And it says, Scooby-Doo taught us that the real monsters are always humans. Deep.
When you have to kill, but it's not laundry day. I switched from stabbing to strangling because I was tired of getting blood on myself.
What does this one say? Be nice to your hairstylist because what's keeping them from plucking one of your hairs out and planting them at a crime scene? Absolutely nothing. Okay, here's the last one. Here's the scene. First date. Her. So what do you do? Him. I'm currently trying to eliminate all cancers. Her. Wow, that's impressive. Him. And then I'll move on to Virgos.
Oh man, that's for astrology and true crime fans.
Yeah, seriously. Oh man, guys, that was loaded. There are so many things.
Well,
We have updates.
Yeah. We have launched our website.
So go online and check out thekillertea.com, see what we're up to. We're still not on TikTok, whatever. I'm not even going to explain myself anymore.
No. As usual, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at The Killer Tea. If you prefer to listen on YouTube, we are also over there. And if you want to send us a message, you can send it via our website, our social medias, or you can email us at thekillertea@gmail.com.
And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review and leave a comment if you listen on Apple Podcasts.
We love you so much.
All right, y'all. Until next time. Bye. Join us in the next episode where we discuss Robert Pickton.
The Pig Farm Killer.
She essentially... There's a lot of going on. I say this is the palate cleanser. You say this is your palate cleanser every fucking time. All right, let's
It's fine. It's nice.
Join us in the next episode where we discuss Richard Picton.
No.
Robert Picton?
Robert Picton.
Picton. What did I say?
You said Richard.
Oh, well, he's a dick. You need to stop yelling at me. I can't work in these environments. I'm sweating now, thanks. God. Okay, stop laughing. God damn it, Chelsea. Join us in the next episode where we discuss the Big Fun Killer.
No, but that is not what I said. I said pig farm. Pig farm.
No.
Not big fun.
I mean, I know a few people who are the Big Fun Killers.
Who?
Oh, I'm pregnant. By the way. Talk about fun killer. I'm kidding. It's a blessing. I'm so excited.